A chance encounter. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the worn brick facade of St. Mary's Orphanage as Officer Daniel Johnson eased his patrol car into the parking lot. He shut off the engine, letting the familiar calm of this place settle over him. It had become his quiet refuge over the past few months, a small escape from the hollow silence of his own home. He adjusted his uniform, exhaled slowly, and stepped out of the car. The gravel crunching under his boots was a stark contrast to the laughter and shouts of children playing just beyond the front doors. As he approached, Sister Margaret greeted him with a warm, knowing smile. "Officer Johnson," she said, her voice kind and patient as always, "the children have been waiting all day for you." Daniel gave her a half-smile. "Please, just call me Daniel." She chuckled, leading him inside. "Well, Daniel, I hope you're ready for a game of tag." They'd been planning their strategy since breakfast. He let out a soft chuckle. "I think I can handle it." Inside the orphanage, the scent of warm bread and fresh paint lingered in the air. A group of kids, no older than 10, were gathered in the playroom, stacking wooden blocks into towers, scribbling colorful drawings, and giggling over whispered jokes. When they spotted Daniel, an excited cheer erupted. "Officer Dan." A handful of children rushed toward him, their small hands tugging at his uniform as they pleaded for him to play. All right, he said, pulling a soft foam ball from his pocket. "Who's up for a game of catch?" The room buzzed with excitement as the kids scrambled to form a circle. As the game got underway, Daniel found himself laughing, genuinely laughing, for the first time in what felt like forever. And then he noticed her. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8, stood slightly apart from the group. She wasn't playing, just watching, her dark brown eyes filled with curiosity. She clutched a sketchbook to her chest, her small fingers gripping the worn cover like it was a lifeline. Daniel lobbed the ball in her direction. "Think fast." She startled but caught it, a hesitant smile flickering across her face. "What's your name?" he asked. "Leah," she said softly, holding the ball for a long moment before gently tossing it back. "Well, Leah, you've got a pretty good throw." She bit her lip, as if holding back a smile, and nodded. As the game continued, Daniel kept an eye on her. She was quiet but observant, occasionally sneaking glances at him while sketching in her book. Something about her reminded him of. No, he shook the thought away. When playtime wound down, he sat on the floor, surrounded by children, reading a story aloud. Leah didn't join the others but settled close by, her fingers moving quickly across her sketchbook's pages. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Sister Margaret called for snack time. Leah stood before the others could rush forward, taking a deep breath before walking up to them. "I can help pass out the snacks," she offered. Daniel nodded, handing her a tray of cookies. "I'd appreciate that." She moved carefully, distributing the treats with precise care, making sure each child got an equal portion. When she finished, she returned to his side and hesitated for a moment before extending her sketchbook toward him. "I drew something," she murmured. Daniel took the book gently. The page displayed a colorful drawing of the game they had played earlier. He recognized himself immediately, sketched in his uniform, surrounded by smiling children. The detail was astonishing. The careful shading, the vibrant colors. "This is incredible," he said sincerely. "You're really talented, Leah." Her face lit up with quiet pride. "Do you really think so?" "Absolutely. Maybe one day you'll be a famous artist." She ducked her head, the tips of her ears turning pink. Maybe. The warmth of the moment settled between them, but soon the reality of time set in. Daniel glanced at his watch. "I should get going." Leah's face fell slightly, but she nodded. "Will you come back?" "Of course," he promised. Before he could move, she did something that caught him completely off guard. She wrapped her small arms around his waist in a tight hug. For a moment, Daniel froze. 1,000 memories rushed forward, his little girl, Sarah, hugging him the same way. The weight of loss pressed heavily against his chest. He blinked rapidly, clearing his throat as he gently patted Leah's back. "See you soon, okay?" She nodded against his uniform before pulling away, her eyes shining with something unreadable. As he walked out to his car, Daniel gripped the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts tangled in emotions he hadn't let himself feel in years. Leah, her bright smile, her quiet resilience, the way she hugged him like she had known him forever. Who was this little girl who saw a father in him? And could he open his heart again, to her, to a future he had long thought lost? The drive home felt longer that night, and for the first time in years, Daniel didn't dread the emptiness of his house. Because something had shifted inside him, and he wasn't sure he wanted it to go back. The weight of a promise. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting warm hues of orange and pink across the city skyline as Daniel pulled into his driveway. His small house, neat and well-maintained, stood in quiet contrast to the chaos of his mind. He sat in his patrol car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, his thoughts circling like a storm. Leah. He couldn't shake the feeling she had stirred inside him. The way she looked at him, hopeful, trusting, made something shift in his chest. It had been years since anyone had looked at him like that. Not since. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples before stepping out of the car. He locked the door behind him, making his way inside. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. It had always been this way since Sarah and Claire were gone. He had kept everything the same, untouched, as if preserving their memory would somehow bring them back. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, the silence felt heavier. Daniel shrugged off his uniform jacket, setting it neatly over the back of the chair before making his way to the living room. His gaze drifted to the framed photographs on the mantel. One, in particular, held his attention. Sarah, his little girl, grinning widely with a missing front tooth. Her small hands clutched his as they stood on the beach, the waves crashing in the background. Claire had taken that photo. Daniel swallowed hard, the memory hitting him like a punch to the gut. It had been 6 years. 6 years since the accident. 6 years since he lost them. The grief was something he had learned to carry, like a heavy coat in the middle of summer, uncomfortable, suffocating, but familiar. It had become a part of him, weighing him down, keeping him from getting too close to anyone again. But Leah, she had cracked something open inside of him, something he thought had sealed shut forever. He exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face before collapsing into his armchair. He needed to stop this. He was just a volunteer, a visitor at the orphanage. He had no right to get attached. And yet, Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, as he stared at his hands. What if Leah didn't have anyone else? He remembered how she had hesitated before hugging him, as if she wasn't used to it, as if she was afraid he'd push her away. His stomach twisted. The orphanage was full of children waiting for someone to choose them. Some were lucky, getting placed into families quickly. Others waited for years. Some never found a home. Was Leah one of them? The thought unsettled him in a way he didn't expect. He stood abruptly, pacing the living room. He needed to talk to Sister Margaret, the visit that changed everything. The next afternoon, Daniel found himself back at Street Mary's, the late autumn air crisp and cool as he parked his patrol car outside the orphanage. The sound of children playing in the yard carried on the breeze, their laughter light and free. But he wasn't here to play games today. He strode inside, his boots clicking against the polished tile floor. Sister Margaret looked up from her desk, her wise eyes twinkling as if she had been expecting him. "Daniel," she greeted warmly, "twice in 1 week. To what do I owe the pleasure?" He hesitated before sinking into the chair across from her. "It's about Leah." Sister Margaret's smile softened. "I had a feeling it might be." Daniel cleared his throat. "How long has she been here?" "Since she was a baby," Sister Margaret said gently. "Her mother passed away shortly after she was born. There were no relatives to claim her, so she's been with us ever since. Daniel's jaw tightened. No one has tried to adopt her. Sister Margaret sighed, folding her hands on the desk. Leah is special. She's bright, creative, and has so much love to give. But families often look for younger children, babies or toddlers. The older a child gets, the harder it becomes for them to be placed in a home. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. She's 8. Sister Margaret nodded. She's had a few potential families show interest over the years, but nothing ever came of it. She tries not to show it, but I know she dreams of being chosen, of having a family. Daniel sat back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He had suspected it, but hearing it out loud made it real. Leah wasn't just another child at the orphanage. She was alone. Sister Margaret watched him for a long moment before speaking again. She's taken a liking to you. Daniel let out a dry chuckle. I noticed. She's a good judge of character, Sister Margaret said with a knowing smile. She sees something in you, Daniel. Something I think you've been trying to hide for a long time. He looked away, swallowing the emotions that threatened to surface. I'm not sure I'm the right person, he admitted quietly. Sister Margaret tilted her head. Why not? I work long hours. My job is dangerous. I don't know if I'd be any good at it, at being a father again. His voice grew rougher with each word. Sister Margaret leaned forward, her expression gentle but firm. Daniel, you already are. He frowned. What do you mean? You care, she said simply. That's more than enough. Daniel let out a slow breath. Could he really do this? Could he open his heart again to a little girl who saw him as something more than just a visitor? Before he could say anything else, a soft knock on the office door interrupted them. The door creaked open, and Leah peeked inside, her big brown eyes shining with uncertainty. Officer Dan, she asked softly, are you busy? Daniel turned to Sister Margaret, who smiled knowingly before standing. I think my work here is done. I'll let you two talk. She exited the room, leaving them alone. Leah shifted on her feet before stepping inside, clutching something behind her back. I made something for you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel watched as she hesitated, then slowly held out her sketchbook. He took it gently, flipping to the page she had marked. It was a drawing of the two of them, him in his uniform, her holding his hand. And above them, in bright, colorful letters, she had written, Can you be my dad? Daniel felt the breath leave his lungs. He stared at the drawing, his hands trembling slightly as a lump formed in his throat. When he looked up, Leah was watching him carefully, waiting, her eyes filled with both hope and fear. He swallowed hard. For years, he had told himself that he couldn't do this again, that his heart was too broken, his life too uncertain. But as he looked at the little girl standing before him, holding out a piece of her heart, something inside him finally clicked into place. Slowly, he reached forward and pulled her into a hug. And for the first time in 6 years, Daniel Johnson let himself cry. The fear of hope. Daniel had spent most of his adult life training himself to react quickly in emergencies. As a police officer, he was accustomed to making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. He had faced armed criminals, high-speed chases, and dangerous confrontations without hesitation. But this was different. This was an 8-year-old girl holding out a drawing with 5 small, carefully written words that had shaken him to his core. Can you be my dad? He had frozen. His throat had gone dry. His hands had trembled slightly as he clutched the sketchbook, unable to tear his eyes away from the simple but powerful image. And then, without thinking, he had pulled her into a hug. Leah had clung to him like he was her last anchor in a storm, her small frame trembling against his. He felt her fingers tighten around the fabric of his uniform, and he instinctively held her tighter, one hand gently cradling the back of her head. He had fought back tears, but it had been a losing battle. It had been 6 years since he lost Sarah, since the accident, since the light had gone out of his life. And yet here he was, holding onto a little girl who saw him as something more than just a visitor. He had never been so terrified in his entire life. A battle with himself. The drive home that night was a blur. The city lights flashed past his windshield, but he barely registered them. Leah's voice, small and hopeful, echoed in his head. "Can you be my dad?" He had promised her he would think about it. It was the only thing he could say in the moment, the only words that made sense when his mind was spinning in 1,000 directions. But the truth was, he didn't need to think about it. He already knew the answer. He wanted to say yes. But the fear, that crushing, suffocating fear, kept him from doing it. What if he wasn't enough? What if he failed her? What if something happened to her? What if he lost her, just like he lost Sarah? Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The pain of his past had been his shield, keeping him from getting too close to anyone, from feeling too much. But Lee had slipped through the cracks of his defenses so effortlessly, and now he was standing at a crossroads, seeking wisdom. He didn't go home right away. Instead, he found himself pulling into a familiar driveway, his sister's house. Maria had always been his voice of reason, his lifeline when things got too overwhelming. As he walked up the steps, the front door opened before he even had the chance to knock. "I was wondering how long it would take you to get here," Maria said with a knowing smile, stepping aside to let him in. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair as he entered. "Do you have some kind of psychic ability I don't know about?" Maria chuckled. "Nope. Just a brother who can't hide when something is eating him up inside. Sit." He obeyed, sinking into the couch as Maria disappeared into the kitchen. Moments later, she returned with 2 cups of coffee, setting one in front of him before sitting across from him. "So," she said, folding her arms, "talk to me." Daniel exhaled slowly. "There's this little girl at the orphanage. Leah." Maria nodded, listening intently. "She asked me to adopt her," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Maria's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't say anything right away. Instead, she leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "And what did you say?" "I told her I'd think about it," Daniel said, rubbing his hands together. "But Maria, I don't know if I can do this." Maria tilted her head. "Why not?" He let out a dry chuckle. "Because I'm not sure I have it in me to be a father again. What if I fail her? What if—" He hesitated, his voice catching. "What if I lose her?" Maria's expression softened. "Danny," she said gently, "do you really think never loving again will protect you from pain?" He looked down, unable to meet her gaze. "I know what happened to Claire and Sarah broke you," she continued. "I know it still hurts every single day. But shutting yourself off from the possibility of happiness won't bring them back." Daniel swallowed hard. Maria reached out, covering his hand with hers. "You were an amazing father to Sarah. You are an amazing father. That hasn't changed." He finally met her eyes. "But what if? What if Lee is exactly what you need?" She interrupted. "What if you're exactly what she needs?" Daniel was silent. Maria squeezed his hand. "You're already thinking about her, worrying about her, wanting to protect her. That's what dads do, Danny. You're already halfway there." The truth of her words settled deep in his chest. She was right. He already cared about Leah, more than he wanted to admit, more than he could admit. The next step. The next morning, Daniel didn't go straight to work. Instead, he found himself back at the orphanage, standing in Sister Margaret's office, his heart pounding in his chest. She looked up from her desk, a knowing glimmer in her eyes. "Daniel," he exhaled, "I want to start the adoption process." A warm smile spread across Sister Margaret's face. "I was hoping you'd say that." She gestured for him to sit as she pulled a thick file from her desk. "Now there's a lot of paperwork involved, and you'll need to go through home studies, interviews, and background checks. The process isn't easy." "I know," Daniel said, rolling his shoulders. but I'm ready." Sister Margaret gave him a long, thoughtful look. "Leah has been through a lot," she said. "She's used to people coming and going. If you do this, Daniel, you need to be all in. She needs to know you're not just another visitor who will leave." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I would never leave her." Sister Margaret studied him for another moment before nodding. "Then let's get started." She handed him a thick stack of forms, and as he looked down at the paperwork in his hands, he felt a strange mix of nerves and determination. He had spent years running from his grief, letting it define him. But Lee had given him something he never thought he'd feel again: hope. And for the first time in 6 years, he was ready to fight for it. The battle for Leah. The paperwork spread across Daniel's dining table, like a puzzle missing half its pieces. Adoption forms, background checks, home study requirements. It was overwhelming, even for someone used to handling stacks of reports and legal documents in his line of work. But this wasn't a case file. This was about Leah, his daughter, or at least she would be if he had any say in it. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his temple before picking up his pen again. He had spent the last several days in a blur of legal meetings, parenting classes, and home preparations. Maria had been a godsend, stepping in whenever he needed support, ensuring that his house was ready for inspections, and helping him through the endless sea of logistics. It was exhausting. And yet, despite the fatigue weighing on him, Daniel found himself waking up each morning with a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in years, his life wasn't just about going through the motions. It was about Leah. And then, everything threatened to fall apart. A call that changed everything. The ringing phone jolted Daniel out of his focus. He grabbed it, glancing at the caller ID. Street Mary's Orphanage. A chill ran down his spine. Something was wrong. "Officer Johnson speaking," he answered, keeping his voice steady. "Daniel." Sister Margaret's voice held an uncharacteristic tension. "I need you to come to the orphanage. Immediately." His grip on the phone tightened. "What happened? Is Lee okay?" There was a long pause. Then, softly, "Her biological aunt has come forward." Daniel's stomach dropped. "What?" "She filed a petition for custody this morning. She wants to take Leah." The words knocked the breath out of him. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "No," he said sharply. "That's not happening." "I understand how you feel, Daniel," Sister Margaret said gently. "But the court will consider her claim. She is Leah's only known biological relative." Daniel ran a hand over his face, forcing himself to think clearly. Where has this aunt been for the last 8 years? She claims she only recently discovered Leah's situation. "Bullshit," Daniel muttered. "Regardless, she has legal standing." Sister Margaret sighed. "You need to come. Leah is confused, and I believe she needs to hear from you." Daniel was already grabbing his jacket. "I'm on my way." A ghost from the past. The moment Daniel stepped through the doors of Street Mary's, he felt the tension in the air. Leah sat in the corner of the playroom, her small frame curled up in one of the oversized armchairs, hugging her sketchbook. She looked up the second he walked in, relief flashing in her eyes. Daniel crouched beside her. "Hey, kiddo." She hesitated before whispering, "You came." "Of course I did," he said, his voice firm. "I'll always come for you." Before she could respond, a voice interrupted them. "You must be Officer Johnson." Daniel turned sharply, his gaze locking onto the woman standing near Sister Margaret's office. Janet Phillips, Leah's biological aunt. She was dressed in expensive but slightly worn clothing, her brown hair styled neatly, her posture confident but rehearsed. Everything about her screamed calculated control. Daniel stood, his jaw tight. "I am. And you are." She extended a hand, but he didn't take it. "I'm Leah's aunt, Janet," she said smoothly. "I understand you've grown attached to my niece." "Attached?" Daniel repeated, his voice low. "Leah isn't some stray puppy I've been attached to. She's a little girl who deserves love, stability, and a home." Where have you been for the last 8 years? Janet's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Family matters are complicated. Daniel crossed his arms. Not complicated enough for you to suddenly show up when I'm in the middle of adopting her. Janet's expression hardened. I have every right to take custody of my niece. She belongs with her blood relatives. Leah flinched at those words. Daniel's blood boiled. He turned to Sister Margaret. I want to contest this. She nodded. We expected that. It will go to court. Janet scoffed. You're a single police officer with an unpredictable job. What kind of life can you give her? Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice. A life where she's wanted, where she's safe, where she's not just a means to an end. Janet's eyes flickered with something. Guilt. Annoyance. She turned on her heel. Then we'll let the court decide. And with that, she walked away. The fight begins. Back at his house, Daniel sat with his lawyer, Evelyn Sharp, a sharp-witted woman with graying hair and an impressive legal record. She skimmed through Janet's petition, her expression unreadable. Here's the problem, she finally said. The court often favors biological relatives. Blood ties carry significant weight. Daniel's stomach churned. She doesn't even know Leah. True, Evelyn said. But she's making a strong case. She claims she's stable, recently married, and wants to reconnect with Leah. If she presents herself well in court, you'll need strong evidence to prove Leah is better off with you. Daniel clenched his jaw. What kind of evidence? Evelyn leaned forward. Character witnesses. People who can testify to your bond with Leah. Proof that you've been there for her. Community support. Daniel nodded. I can get that. Evelyn tapped her pen against the desk. And Daniel, you need to prepare yourself. This could get ugly. He exhaled. I don't care how ugly it gets. I'm not losing her. A community rallies. Word spread fast. By the next morning, his police station, his neighborhood, and even local business owners had rallied behind him. Lisa, his longtime friend and fellow officer, grabbed his arm at work. Whatever you need, we're here. Mrs. Chen, his elderly neighbor, stopped him on his way home. I'll write a statement about what a good man you are. At the orphanage, Sister Margaret, Mrs. Hammond, and even other children spoke about the difference he had made. The community center hosted a fundraiser to help with legal costs. And Leah. She held his hand tighter every time he visited, her small fingers clinging like she was afraid he'd slip away. One evening, as he tucked her in at the orphanage, she whispered, Are you going to leave too? Daniel's heart shattered. He knelt beside her bed, brushing a stray braid from her face. Never, he said. I promise, Leah. I will fight for you. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. Okay, she whispered. And just like that, she believed in him. Now he just had to make sure the court did too. The battle for Leah intensifies. The cold air nipped at Daniel's face as he stepped out of his patrol car in front of the courthouse. The grand stone building loomed ahead, its towering columns and heavy wooden doors making the entire structure feel more imposing than necessary. But Daniel wasn't intimidated, not by the building, not by the legal process. What he feared, what gripped his chest in a tight, painful hold, was the idea of losing Leah. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself before stepping inside. His lawyer, Evelyn Sharp, was already waiting for him in the lobby, flipping through a thick legal folder. She looked up when she saw him, her sharp eyes scanning him with the precision of a seasoned attorney. Nervous? She asked. Daniel rolled his shoulders. I'm ready. Evelyn smirked. Good, because Janet Phillips has hired an aggressive legal team. This won't be easy. Daniel's jaw tightened. I don't care how hard it is. I'm not backing down. She gave a firm nod. Then let's get to work. Inside the courtroom. The courtroom was eerily quiet. Janet sat across from him, dressed in a carefully chosen outfit that screamed responsible guardian. Her attorney, a smooth-talking man named Peter Calloway, leaned in to whisper something in her ear. She nodded, her lips curving into a polite but rehearsed smile. Daniel ignored them, instead focusing on the one person who truly mattered, Leah. She sat beside Sister Margaret, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked nervous but hopeful. When her eyes met Daniel's, she gave him a tiny, hesitant smile. He smiled back. The judge, a stern-looking man in his 60s, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "We are here today to determine the custody of Leah Phillips," he announced. "I expect both parties to remain respectful. My decision will be made in the best interest of the child." Janet's attorney stood first, his voice smooth and persuasive. "Your Honor, my client is Leah's biological aunt. She has a stable home, a husband, and the financial means to provide for her niece. Blood ties should not be ignored." Daniel clenched his jaw. Then it was Evelyn's turn. She stood with effortless confidence, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "Your Honor, while blood ties are important, stability and emotional connection are paramount in determining a suitable guardian. Officer Johnson has built a deep and meaningful relationship with Leah. Unlike the petitioner, he has been present in her life, providing emotional support, consistency, and care." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Furthermore, we have evidence that Mrs. Phillips has had financial difficulties in the past, including multiple bankruptcies." Janet's attorney quickly objected. "That is irrelevant. My client is financially stable now." Evelyn turned toward him. "Then let's address the fact that Mrs. Phillips has never once attempted to visit or contact Leah in the past 8 years." Silence. The judge turned to Janet. "Mrs. Phillips, can you explain why you never sought custody before now?" Janet hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edges of the table. I didn't know about her situation," she finally said. Evelyn didn't let up. "And yet, after 8 years of silence, you suddenly appeared right when Officer Johnson filed for adoption. That timing is highly suspect." Janet's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Daniel could see the cracks forming. And then it was his turn to take the stand. Daniel's testimony. As he settled into the witness chair, Evelyn approached with calm authority. "Officer Johnson, can you describe your relationship with Leah?" Daniel exhaled, glancing toward the little girl who had turned his world upside down. "I met Leah at St. Mary's during my volunteer visits," he began. "At first, she was just another child who needed someone to throw a ball with. But over time, she became much more. She's bright, creative, and incredibly kind. She's not just some case file to me. She's my daughter." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, but he didn't care. Evelyn nodded. "Have you taken steps to ensure you can provide a stable home for her?" "Yes," Daniel said firmly. "I've arranged my work schedule to ensure she has consistency. My sister, Maria, has agreed to assist with childcare when needed. I have a strong support system, including colleagues, neighbors, and the community." Evelyn walked closer. "And what does Leah mean to you?" Daniel's throat tightened. "She gave me back something I lost a long time ago," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Hope. Family. A reason to wake up in the morning." He turned to the judge, his hands gripping the edges of his chair. "I don't care about biology. I don't care about paperwork. I care about her. I love her. And I will fight for her with everything I have." Silence filled the room. For the first time, Janet looked uncertain. The judge studied Daniel for a long moment before speaking. "We will reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments. Court is adjourned." The night before the verdict, Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, running a hand through his hair. Tomorrow, a judge would decide Leah's future. It was out of his hands now. His phone buzzed. A message from Maria. "No matter what happens, Leah knows you love her. And love always wins." Daniel sighed, setting the phone down. He didn't get much sleep that night. The verdict. The next day, the courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and officers from Daniel's precinct. Leah sat anxiously beside Sister Margaret, clutching her sketchbook. Daniel barely breathed as the judge entered. "This court has carefully reviewed all evidence presented," he began. "We have considered both parties' ability to provide stability, financial support, and emotional care." Daniel's heart pounded. The petitioner, Mrs. Phillips, is Leah's biological relative. However, she has demonstrated little involvement in Leah's life up until this point. Additionally, financial records raise concerns about her motivations. Janet's shoulders tensed. The judge turned toward Daniel. "Officer Johnson, while your profession carries certain challenges, it is evident that you have built a strong, nurturing bond with Leah. Your commitment to her well-being has been overwhelmingly supported by community testimony." Daniel gripped the table so hard his knuckles turned white. The judge exhaled. "This court rules in favor of Daniel Johnson. Full custody is granted." Time seemed to freeze. Leah gasped, her eyes widening before she jumped from her chair and ran straight to him. Daniel barely had time to stand before she threw her arms around his waist, clinging to him with all her strength. "You're my dad," she whispered against his chest. Daniel's throat closed, his arms wrapping tightly around her. "Yeah, kiddo," he murmured. "I'm your dad." Tears burned in his eyes as he held her close, as the courtroom erupted into whispers and relieved smiles. For the first time in years, his heart felt whole again. Leah was finally home, building a home, brick by brick. The courtroom had faded into memory, but the moment Leah called him Dad stayed with Daniel like a permanent echo in his heart. She was his daughter now. Legally, permanently. It should have been the end of the battle. But in reality, it was only the beginning. Because now, Daniel had to do something far scarier than fighting in court. He had to be a father again, and he had no idea where to start. The first day home, Daniel stood in the middle of Leah's new room, hands on his hips, scanning the space with nervous energy. It had taken weeks of preparation. Fresh lavender paint on the walls, new shelves for her books, a soft, star-patterned comforter on the bed. But standing here now, he felt a weight pressing against his chest. Would she like it? Would she be happy here? A small hand slipped into his. "It's so pretty," Leah whispered, her wide brown eyes sweeping over the room. Relief flooded through Daniel. "You like it?" he asked, kneeling beside her. Leah nodded, stepping forward hesitantly. She ran her fingers along the bookshelf, her touch light and cautious, as if she was afraid this wasn't real. "I never had a room that was mine before," she admitted softly. Daniel swallowed past the lump in his throat. "Well," he said gently, "this one is all yours, sweetheart. No one can take it from you." Leah turned to him, her expression vulnerable. "Not even if I mess up." Daniel's chest tightened. He crouched down so they were eye level, his hands resting on her small shoulders. "Leah, listen to me," he said firmly. "This is your home. No matter what happens, if you get in trouble, if you make mistakes, if you spill juice all over the couch, you still belong here." Leah blinked rapidly, as if trying to hold back tears. Then, without warning, she threw her arms around his neck, burying her face into his shoulder. Daniel closed his eyes and held her close. Brick by brick, they were building something new. A home. A family. The learning curve. Being a father again was a disaster. At least at first. Daniel had spent his entire adult life as a police officer, trained to handle high-pressure situations with precision and control. But nothing had prepared him for the absolute chaos of a morning routine. Leah was a sleepy, grumpy mess when she woke up. Getting her dressed and fed in time for school felt like a hostage negotiation gone wrong. Homework. Daniel could defuse a bomb faster than he could explain third-grade math. Thankfully, Maria had stepped in before Leah's confusion turned into tears. Grocery shopping. Leah somehow managed to sneak an absurd number of sugary snacks into the cart, and Daniel, like a complete fool, didn't notice until checkout. But there were good moments too. Like the time they spent an entire Saturday morning assembling a dollhouse, only to realize he had put the roof on backward. Or when he taught her how to ride a bike in the park, running beside her as she wobbled forward, giggling with excitement. Or the first time she called him Dad casually, without thinking about it, just a simple, "Dad, can we get ice cream?" And how that one little word had nearly knocked him off his feet. They weren't perfect, but they were trying. And that had to be enough. The first bad day. Not every day was filled with laughter. One evening, Daniel found Leah curled up on the couch, her knees tucked to her chest. She was quiet, too quiet. Something was wrong. Daniel sat down beside her, not speaking right away. After a few minutes, Leah finally whispered, "Jenny at school said I don't really have a dad." Daniel's stomach twisted. She said that real dads don't have to go to court to keep their kids. A sharp wave of anger rose in him, but he pushed it down. Leah didn't need his frustration. She needed him. He took a slow breath before speaking. "Leah," he said gently, "being a dad isn't about blood or paperwork. It's about showing up, loving you, being here every single day, no matter what." Leah peeked up at him. "Even when I'm mad." "Especially when you're mad," Daniel assured her. "Even when you slam your door, even when you get in trouble, even when you don't want to talk to me, I'll still be your dad." Her lip quivered. "Forever." Daniel reached over, pulling her into his arms. "Forever," he promised. Leah sniffled, then sighed against his chest. "Okay." Daniel pressed a kiss to the top of her head. She didn't say it, but he knew she believed him. And that meant everything. A surprise for Leah. A month after the adoption was finalized, Daniel had an idea. Something big. He spent an entire weekend sneaking around, working in the garage after Leah went to bed, getting everything just right. Then, on a bright Saturday morning, he woke her up early. "Come on, sleepyhead," he said, grinning as she groaned in protest. "Dad," she whined, pulling the blanket over her head. "It's Saturday." "Trust me," he said. "You're gonna want to see this." She grumbled but got up, rubbing sleep from her eyes as he led her outside. When she saw it, she froze. A treehouse. Her own treehouse. Leah's mouth fell open as she took in the little wooden structure, nestled between the branches of the big oak in their backyard. A small ladder led up to the entrance, and inside, he had set up a cozy reading corner, complete with pillows and fairy lights. "You made this," she gasped. Daniel smiled. "Had some help from Maria, and a few friends. But yeah." Leah turned to him, eyes wide. "For me." "Who else?" Daniel chuckled. Leah stared at the treehouse for a long moment. Then, without warning, she tackled him in a hug so fierce it nearly knocked him over. "I love it," she whispered against his chest. Daniel swallowed hard, hugging her back. "I love you," he murmured. Leah squeezed him tighter. "I love you too, Dad." Daniel closed his eyes, breathing her in. 6 years ago, he had lost everything. But somehow, in the most unexpected way, life had given him a second chance. And he wasn't going to waste it. The meaning of forever. It had been 6 months since Leah became his daughter. 6 months of laughter, of bedtime stories, of grocery store mishaps, of mornings where he still couldn't figure out how an 8-year-old could be so slow at getting ready for school. 6 months of learning how to be a father again. Daniel had gone from being a man who lived in silence to a man who woke up to a little girl singing off-key in the bathroom while brushing her teeth. From someone who ate dinner alone at the counter to someone who had tea parties with stuffed animals. His house was no longer a museum of the past. It was a home. Their home. But just because they were building something good didn't mean the past had disappeared. Because in the quiet moments, when Leah thought he wasn't looking, he could still see the ghosts in her eyes. The fear that he would leave. That forever didn't really mean forever. The nightmare. It started on a Thursday night. Daniel had fallen asleep on the couch, the soft hum of the TV filling the room, when he woke to a sound he hadn't heard in years. A scream. His heart leaped into his throat as he bolted upright, his instincts firing on all cylinders. He sprinted down the hall, bursting into Leah's room just in time to see her thrashing beneath her blankets, her small hands gripping the sheets, her face twisted in terror. "No," she whimpered, eyes clenched shut. "Don't leave me. Please don't go." Daniel's chest ached. He moved carefully, kneeling beside her bed, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Leah, it's okay, sweetheart. I'm here." She gasped awake, eyes wide and panicked, her breaths coming in sharp, ragged bursts. Daniel didn't ask what she had dreamed about. He already knew. She looked at him like she wasn't sure he was real. "You're still here," she whispered. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. "I'm always here." She lunged forward, wrapping her arms around his neck, burying her face into his shoulder. He held her just as tightly. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked softly. Leah shook her head. He didn't push. Instead, he carried her to the couch, wrapped her in her favorite blanket, and made them both mugs of warm milk. They sat in silence for a long time, her small body curled against his side, her fingers clutching his sleeve like he might disappear. Eventually, her breathing evened out, her head growing heavier against his chest. But just as she was drifting off, she mumbled, "What if one day you change your mind?" Daniel felt like the air had been sucked from his lungs. "Leah," he said, tilting her chin up so she had to look at him. "That's never going to happen." She hesitated, her little fingers fidgeting with the hem of his sleeve. "You promise?" Daniel didn't just say the words. He sealed them with everything in him. "I swear to you, Leah, no matter what happens, you're my daughter. Forever." Something shifted in her eyes, like she wanted to believe it, but the part of her that had been let down too many times was still afraid. So Daniel decided he needed to prove it. A name that meant something. The next morning, Daniel had a plan. While Leah was at school, he made a stop at the courthouse. It took hours of paperwork, but he didn't care. When Leah came home that afternoon, he sat her down at the kitchen table. "I have something for you," he said, sliding a folder across the surface. She frowned, opening it carefully. Her brows furrowed as she scanned the official-looking document inside. "What is this?" Daniel leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "It's a legal name change request," he said gently. "If you want to, you can take my last name." Leah's mouth parted slightly. She stared at the paper, her eyes wide with something Daniel couldn't quite place. "It's up to you," he continued. "You don't have to change it. But I wanted you to know that if you want to, I'd be honored if you were officially Leah Johnson." Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Leah traced her fingers over the words on the page. "Leah Johnson," she whispered. She tested it on her tongue like it was something fragile, something precious. Then she looked up, her eyes shining with something that made Daniel's chest ache. "Really?" she whispered. "Really," he said. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she was smiling, her small fingers gripping the edge of the paper like it was the most important thing in the world. "Okay," she whispered, her voice shaky but certain. "I want to be Leah Johnson." Daniel reached across the table, taking her little hand in his. "Then Leah Johnson it is. A forever family." The day her name became official, they celebrated in the backyard with Maria and a few close friends. Leah insisted on decorating the whole place with streamers, and Daniel didn't have the heart to tell her she went overboard. When the cake was brought out, Maria stood up and tapped her glass with a spoon. "I think we all know why we're here," she said, smiling warmly at Leah. "We're here to celebrate officially welcoming the newest Johnson into the family." Everyone clapped, but Leah was staring at Daniel, her face unreadable. Daniel stood, feeling the weight of every moment they had shared. The laughter, the struggles, the quiet fears she had never spoken aloud. He cleared his throat. "Leah, when I met you, I didn't know I was looking for you. But I was." Her eyes softened. "You changed my life. he continued, voice thick with emotion. And I promise, for the rest of my days, I will do everything I can to be the father you deserve. Tears slipped down Leah's cheeks, but she was smiling. Daniel opened his arms, and without hesitation, she ran into them. Everyone clapped. But for Daniel, the world had shrunk to just this moment. Just the little girl in his arms. His daughter. His forever. A father's journal. That night, after Lee had fallen asleep, Daniel sat in his living room, a leather-bound journal resting in his lap. He had started writing to Leah months ago, wanting to give her something to look back on one day. Tonight, he picked up his pen and began. Dear Leah, today you became Leah Johnson. But the truth is, you've always been my daughter. The moment you looked up at me with those big brown eyes and asked if I could be your dad, my heart already knew the answer. You saved me just as much as I saved you. You are my second chance, my home, my greatest adventure, and I will love you for every day of my life. Forever. Dad. Daniel closed the journal, exhaled, and leaned back in his chair. Outside, the stars burned bright in the night sky. Inside, the house was full of warmth. And for the first time in 6 years, Daniel Johnson was exactly where he belonged. At home. With his daughter. Forever.